you'll have your full time. So hi everybody, welcome on behalf of the Faculty Honors Council. My name is Allison. I am one of the research and instruction librarians, and I am thrilled to introduce to you Nathaniel Kirsten doing polarization and congressional functionality. So you've got 20 minutes. I will signal you at 5 minutes and 1 minute to go. And then we've got 5 minutes for Q&A afterwards, so if you don't mind holding your questions, that would be fantastic. All right, it's all yours.
Hello everyone, I'm Nathaniel Kirsten, and as was said, I'm going to be going over polarization and congressional functionality, specifically on the committee stage in the legislative process. But before I kind of go into that, my core claim, I wanted to give a thank you to Dr. Tristan Hightower, my thesis advisor, and also my editorial reviewer, Professor Marianne Clark, who have helped me on this journey, and I definitely would not have the confidence to stand up here today if it was not for their help. So going forward, I wanted to first go over my core claim, where, as you can see, I wanted to come to the conclusion that committees will increasingly act as strategic gatekeepers, where not only will they shape what Congress does, but they also will equally shape what Congress does not do. So going on from there, I kind of wanted to have a little bit of a roadmap so you guys are prepared for what I'm going to go over here. So first, I'm just going to go over why this topic actually matters, why it's influential, and why you should really know about it. After that, I'm going to go into my research question and the thesis argument that I actually want to present to all of you today, in which case I will then go over why committees actually matter. That is also important to establish here because not everyone's going to know this process. And then we're going to go over the evidence from 3 cases. This is going to be important in understanding my thesis, and it's also going to back my argument here, so it's going to be important to actually see it in action when I'm arguing. And then we're going to go over what these findings actually mean for Congress, maybe some future implications, and again, why it's important to understand this topic. So starting off here, just why this topic matters. These are a couple important points that I just really wanted to point out as it kind of raises questions here. So the first point is that political polarization has intensified sharply since the late 20th century. This has been a point that is important because it could lead to legislators making certain decisions on polarization, in which case they may make certain decisions that confirm their standing more in Congress, or may just back their constituent base in which they have to support more. Going on from that, we have legislative productivity and bipartisan cooperation is weakened. This goes into the first point where I said, where again, legislators may act in a certain way that's more beneficial for them, and there's a case of risk avoidance, which I will talk about later in the presentation a little bit, but right now it's just a point I wanted to put there. And then we have public trust in Congress, which can decline as visible conflict and hidden inaction have increased. So when you think of legislators, again, in the committee stage, most people may not be able to actually see it. And so because of this, people may have issues with Congress. They may see it as a slow lock-making body, and this will cause issues for the general public, which again will decline public trust as a result of that. And so these patterns that I had discovered really raised the basic question for me, which is, how is Congress now functioning as a lawmaking body? And so you can take all this in consideration. Again, this is why the topic matters, but why exactly is this important for my thesis? Well, it shows how the problem is not just disagreements on the floor stage of the legislative process, and it actually happens before that internally, where polarization can change this process and it will determine whether major bills will actually ever reach that stage. Moving forward, this is one of the 2 graphs that I put in my thesis. So as you can see here, this is specifically party means in the House over time. And specifically, you could see like maybe towards the mid-century here, how it was closer. And then as you get into my highlighted region, you see how it gradually separates through the modern era. And this really shows how polarization has impacted the House. And also, if you're worried about the Senate as well, don't worry, I also incorporated that here, specifically in this graph. So going from the House that I showed, specifically in the highlighted area here, you see how in the 1990s around forward in the modern era, you could see how polarization has increased it more over time, and it's rather steep here, and it just increases from there as a result of that. So just having that little bit of background, I'm gonna present my research question now. So how does rising partisan polarization affect congressional functionality? And specifically what I want to look at again was the committee stage. So how do committees shape these legislative outcomes within a polarized Congress? So the focus that I wanted to have here was not only on the voting outcomes that occur within Congress, but it had to do with the internal process that determines whether these bills would actually advance at all. Moving forward from there, I had my core argument where I want to state that committees will act as institutional gatekeepers, and if you're a little bit confused by that wording or you're not certain what I mean, don't worry, that will be defined in the next slide, but I just wanted to kind of put it out there first. So what I mean where committees will act as institutional gatekeepers, not only will they evaluate policy based on merit, but they will also, within a polarized environment, determine whether controversial proposals will actually move forward at all. And so I just wanted to put a little graph here where you can see polarization, committee risk aversion, and finally legislative inaction. So what I'm trying to present here is basically where in a polarized environment, there would be times where maybe committees, legislators within that will take risk aversion, as I had mentioned before. And because of that, there would be instances of inaction where most bills will not make it past the committee stage. And so the main takeaway that I really wanted to have here was that polarization will change what reaches the floor and also what will quietly stop before it reaches the floor. And again, this will contribute to whether or not people will see Congress as a lawmaking body, and then it could also lead to issues whether they see Congress as a productive lawmaking body. So again, here you go. This is as promised. What does gatekeeping actually mean here? So when I refer to gatekeeper, I specifically mean as controlling access to the next stage in decision making, the next stage in the legislative process where it might not make it past the committee stage. And so within Congress, committees have the power to decide whether bills get hearings, whether they will get markups, and also if they will receive report outs. And so why exactly does this matter? Well, it shows that the power makes committees central to what Congress does do and equally as what it does not do as a result of that. And so if a bill dies in a committee, the public will often never see the conflict that stopped it, and this will lead to issues within the public, especially if in a polarized environment where they may hold stronger opinions. So what does the literature show? So the literature that I presented in my thesis showed a couple main points I wanted to contribute here. One of the first points that the literature I reviewed showed that partisan contributes to gridlock, and it also weakens bipartisan cooperation, which again, which could lead why it stops the committee stage and it may not make it past that stage. And then also party competition increasingly outweighs policy compromise. And then this also will go into the next point where legislative incentives will shift toward risk avoidance. I'm going to bring this point up a lot because I think it's very important where in a polarized environment, legislators will act in a certain way that will benefit them, will benefit their constituent base, and as a result, they may have to make hard decisions depending on a bill, even if it's relevant at the time, even how influential it could be. And in my 3 cases I will show later in the presentation, you will see this. And so finally, because of this, I see that Congress becomes less effective as a policymaking institution as a result of this, where most bills will not make it past the committee stage. And so most of the research that I looked at had emphasized 3 things, which was voting behavior, elections, and finally it focused on broad institutional outcomes. And so that left an opening for me to look at, well, what happens inside Congress before it actually hits that floor stage in the legislative process. In which case, I saw that opening as the research gap, which I will present here, and my contribution because of it. So as I had said, most of the research did not focus on how polarization operates inside Congress at the committee stage. And so because of this, I saw an opening, and therefore my contribution that I wish to have with my thesis is that it will treat committees specifically as a mechanism that links polarization to legislative inaction, and then it's going to move the focus from more of the visible votes that you will see and most people will not see into the earlier institutional choices that will actually determine whether these major bills will advance at all. So again, that's going to be at the committee stage. Most people may not even see what occurs at this stage in the process. So how a bill moves through Congress, I have my little contribution here. Thank you, Dr. Tristan Hightower, for this recommendation. Mr. Bill, I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill sitting in here on Capitol Hill, quite an iconic line. So as you have this process through Congress, you have first Mr. Bill is introduced, in which case he will then go into the committee stage. And as you may see, this is the highlighted point I want to have here. I was mentioning in the process where most bills will actually never make it past this stage. And because of this, this is where committee gatekeeping will actually matter the most in this process. And obviously, if the bill doesn't happen to go through, it will then go through for consideration, will either receive passage or failure, and then finally, it will go to the president. So committees in a historical and a modern context, I wanted to provide a little bit of background, maybe just to understand committees a little bit better and kind of how they evolved through time to get into the modern context. So more in the post-World War II era, you could see that the committee chairs specifically had held strong autonomy, and there was also a focus more on specialization and expertise really mattered at this period. While going into the post-reform era, party leadership had grew stronger for committees, and additionally, committee independence had declined during this time period. And while moving into our modern Congress, you could see that polarization increased risk, and then committees act more strategically, which again connects to my point where legislators are going to act into a way where depending on the views that they have or depending on how the risk is, they may completely avoid certain bills and avoid interacting with them. So research design. So the research design that I want to present here is that I have my theory, I have a mechanism, and then finally the evidence of the 3 cases that I'm going to go over momentarily. But first, for my theory, was that I want to present polarization changes incentives within Congress, inside of Congress, and my mechanism here was specifically I wanted to see how committees will function as these institutional gatekeepers as I defined before, And then finally, the evidence that I'm about to present to you has to do with the 3 case studies that show how bills stall or advance. So the cases that I examined here were the American Health Care Act in 2017, immigration reforms in 2013 and 2018, and then finally we will be looking at the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that occurred between 2020 and 2021. So the first case, as promised, this is the American Health Care Act in 2017. So a little bit of background to kind of understand this is that Republicans at the time had held a unified government where they held the House, Senate, and the presidency under Donald Trump in 2017 at the time. And so going on to the next point, this had created strong expectations that the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, also most of you may also know as Obamacare, this ended up, they would expect it would be repealed or replaced quickly as a result of this unified Republican government. While it ended up the AHCA moved through the House committees quickly, there were still issues where Republican factions had ended up wanting different outcomes, where the stronger conservatives had pushed for this deeper repeal, while more of the moderates were worried about coverage losses as a result of this. And so this ended up leading to the effort ultimately failing within the Senate. So this is nice to kind of lay out, but again, why exactly does this matter for this point? Well, it showed how even within this unified government, when the Republicans had held at the time, it was not enough to overcome the polarization that had been within the governing party, where, as I had said before, the conservatives were pushing more for deeper repeal, while the moderates were more concerned about coverage losses, which again ultimately helped it fail in the Senate. And so committee advancement was possible in this aspect, but coalition unity was not, which ended up leading to the issues that occurred here. So moving on to case study number 2, these are immigration reforms in 2013 and specifically in 2018. So in 2013, the Senate had passed a bipartisan immigration bill under President Obama at the time. And so this made immigration at the time one of the strongest opportunities for bipartisan reform to occur. And while it was one of the strongest opportunities, House committees ended up not advancing a comprehensive response, which as a result, House leaders instead had ended up favoring a more narrow and piecemeal approach. And in 2018, similar deadlock had reappeared in 2018, where immigration debates under President Trump at the time. And so again, why does this matter? Well, it shows that this case where committees can block major legislation without actually directly defeating it or interacting with it in this aspect, where it didn't advance through House committees, but there were still issues that occurred at the time. And then just simply refusing to move a broad bill forward can sometimes be enough. And in cases like this, you could see within Congress how there were still issues and polarization was still very active for this, and it caused issues at the time, whether it was still relevant or whether it was not. So moving on to case study number 3, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act for 2020 and in 2021. So George Floyd's killing in 2020 under President Trump had sparked nationwide protests, and then there was also major pressures for reform from the public at the time. And so the House had ended up passing a broad policing reform bill, and negotiations actually continued into 2021 under President Biden at the time. And so because of this, there were disagreements over qualified immunity, as well as federal oversight that ended up blocking compromise for this. And so while it went from 2020 into 2021, it still showed that there was no bipartisan agreement that was actually reached during this time period. And so again, why does this matter? It showed how even with the high public pressure that they were going through, additionally through 2 administrations, through President Trump and President Biden, the strategic limits that had been created by polarization still created this environment where it was not able to actually be reached through a bipartisan agreement. So just a comparative pattern across the cases. So this was just an excerpt I wanted to take from my thesis. So across each case, committees had served as the first point at which partisan conflict actually translated into legislative inaction. And so while the specific policy area or issue may have changed, the same institutional logic had kept appearing, where polarization was very influential with it, either when committees had filtered controversial issues early on in the process, whether risk avoidance had ended up shaping these legislative choices at all, or whether gridlock often began before floor debate had even occurred. So my key findings, there are 3 key findings I really want to present with all of you here today after going through all of this work. One was that committees had actually filtered legislation, and by this I mean that the committee stage is often where controversial proposals had actually been stopped in the process. And that connects also into the second key finding, where polarization had raised risk because of this, where legislators had maybe had stronger incentives to simply avoid compromise or difficult votes, and because of this, it had led to specific filters where they may have blocked it early into the legislative process. And going on into the third key finding, inaction had become strategic because of this. And so gridlock is often produced before the floor stage and not just during it, where legislators will make these very difficult decisions. And at times, it's again because to back their current standing within Congress, to back their constituent base, or simply just to hold their standing where they currently are. So why exactly does this matter for Congress, and why does this matter for governance in general? Well, for Congress, it shows that less capacity to address major and complex policy problems will occur because there are going to be issues where, again, bills will be stopped early into the legislative process, and then more hidden gridlock will occur before floor debate, where this will cause issues in the legislative process. It will be early, and then most people will never see this happen because of it. And committees will become strategic filters. This is, again, just more of a simple term when I'm saying committees will act as strategic gatekeepers, and they will stop certain bills within this process. And so while this matters for governance, this matters for Congress, why exactly will this matter for governance now? Well, it shows that power will shift towards the executive and courts as a result of this. At times, if maybe bills are stalled continuously, or if there are issues from legislators not wanting to advance controversial issues, then this may lead to the executive or courts ending up having to take action as a result of that. And so public trust may also decline further. Again, this was the point I wanted to contribute to it, was that the public may not see what's happening at certain stages of this process, and because of it, public trust may decline within Congress, and they may continue to see it as a slow lawmaking body, if they even see it as a lawmaking body by this point. And so for the last point, I wanted to show that representation suffers when inaction will end up actually dominating. And so while inaction will occur at the committee stage, representation may have issues because of this. And then when it suffers, then again, they may not be able to properly represent their constituent base as legislators, or there may be issues in which they try to contribute as a result of that within Congress. And so my conclusion I ended up actually coming to is that I saw that committees will shape what Congress does not do, again, as equally as what Congress does do. So polarization had reshaped that institutional behavior within Congress, and as a result, committees had turned into these defined strategic gatekeepers where they were stop certain bills early in the legislative process. And then this will help explain why legislative capacity will decline even before a bill will reach the floor. So just with its conclusion, I'll go over a little bit more, but basically what I really wanted to show here is that Congress is a lawmaking body, it's a lawmaking institution, and because of that, it's very important for the public to realize that maybe at times where they may not see everything visibly, there is still things happening within Congress, and not only can committees in this specific aspect shape what Congress does do, it can also equally shape what Congress does not do, because that is equally as important. While Congress will pass bills, Congress will also not pass bills, and this is important to realize that it may, again, go through the process, there may be markups, there may be changes as a result of this, and it may once again go through this process. But as gatekeepers, committees are very strong, especially since, as you saw in the previous little outline I wanted to show to you, it's very early into the process. And so because of that, it's just important to note that most bills do not make it through that stage, and that it's just important to consider it. So, thank you. Dr. Hightower.
So my first is more of a comment than a question, but I think it's kind of the prerogative of the advisor to say, it's been a pleasure working with you, Nate. It feels like it's been a long journey since that Congress class and traveling to DC. So
yes,
it's been a lot of fun most of the time going back and forth all the revisions, and you should be really proud of all the work that you've done. I guess the first question I'll throw out there very quick. Do you think the public is wrong to have this decline in trust, or are they just wrong about the reason for their decline in trust with Congress? So in other words, are they right to think Congress is bad, but they're wrong about the reason, or should they think Congress is actually pretty good at its job?
I think it kind of depends on the perspective you're looking at it. Maybe if you look at the American population that may not be as educated, so when they take the little pieces of information that they can at the time, whether they kind of look at the news, or maybe if they look at certain articles every once in a while, then I guess I can kind of understand their views. Because maybe since, again, they don't have that proper education, or maybe their current standing in the economy, they may not be able to access certain privileges or pieces of information that others may be able to have access to. While maybe if you're more educated, or if you have more access to certain pieces of information, that I feel that maybe by that point you should probably have enough access to really understand that Congress as a lawmaking institution is still working as hard as they can, but it's just not always able to be visibly seen, whether in news articles, whether through figure of speech, or whether just through whatever resource they want to use to get that information.
How did you come up with the 3 cases that you chose? Where did those come from?
So the 3 cases that I decided to focus on is because specifically they kind of showed how during that time period they were influential. Like during the George Floyd case, you could see it was basically right after his killing. There was a lot of public pressure, whether it was for their immigration reforms, which again were very influential at the time, or whether it was for the last case that I focused on. So kind of just looking at that, I think that it was important to kind of take them out because they weren't very minute bills. They were more bills. They were more major bills that focused on what the public really wanted at the time, which again shows how Congress was trying to act as a lawmaking institution for the general public, but just at times, because of polarization, it was impacted in a negative way.
So I'm just curious whether there's actually statistical change in the different periods. Because I think you're absolutely right that a lot of stuff dies in committee, and that particularly a lot of stuff never even gets voted on, it just gets sort of stuck there. But is that any different than it has ever been? In the sense, like, Woodrow Wilson wrote his PhD at Johns Hopkins about congressional committees and basically argued like that's where the action is. And that was a very different era. So I'm sort of wondering, like, is it actually any different now that it's more polarized? Or is it really kind of the same pattern that committees have always been the case? My guess, just intuitively, would be it would depend on the gap in the party distribution. So like if the committee is 60% Democrat, you're much more likely to get something through than if it's 50-50. So if polarization is being a measure not of political attitude, but just balance of power, I would think that would be a key variable. But I would be curious to know like how that plays out over time.
I think it would definitely be interesting to look into that. Because I like the point you just made with that. The case study I had done where, again, at one point Republicans had actually held the unified government. Even within that party, there were still issues where Republicans that were more conservative and more moderate had issues that ended up leading to that bill actually not even being passed. But just looking more statistically into it, I think that if I did like further studies or if someone else had done further studies at that and maybe took more a statistical approach and looking more at the specifics for that, then you could probably definitely find more like accurate terminology for it.
I mean, I think your hardest problem would be that most things don't fail because they don't get voted on, they fail because they never get voted on, and so you'd have to kind of decide like what is the statistic you're measuring? Failed at committee vote, or just bills submitted that died anywhere, in which case, again, you get different numbers depending on which way you looked at that. But I would just be curious. I would think that Professor Hightower, Mr. Stats, would have told you like, well, where's the stat part?
Do you want me to answer, or do you want? I'll hold that for Dr. Moore. Do you have a question?
I do have a question, Dr. Dietrich. My question is about how you operationalize the term polarization, right? Because I noticed a couple of things here. You seem to suggest at the beginning of the presentation that polarization concerned polarization between parties. But then as you were discussing the different committees and the bills, what you were actually talking about was sort of inter-party, the polarization happening within parties, right, between the more moderates and the more extreme. So, how does that play out in your study? Do you measure those differences in polarization? Because I think we often just assume that the Democrats and Republicans are always going to be at odds, when in fact within parties we have these kind of extreme approaches as well.
Yeah, of course. So I can actually go back to the slides that I had for those. So when I was just talking about these, I just kind of wanted to put like a basic thought out there to to everyone who was kind of looking at this for my study, where I just wanted to generalize polarization at first, where I just wanted to show that it's there and it's increasing. So what you can definitely see here in the highlighted regions, again, this was at the House over time, and specifically this was in the House and Senate. So when I presented these, I just wanted to have kind of like an eye-opener for the audience and everyone to kind of see it. So then when I went more into the specifics of what my actual study went through, then you can kind of understand like, oh, okay, well, not only is it increasing in generalized terms, but also internally it's getting impacted like pretty exponentially as well as a result of that.
So I think that's the interesting finding that you have here.
I appreciate it, thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Can moms cry in pride?
Absolutely.
Bye. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everybody.